I have a question for Anka. I wanted to ask you to talk, I know we don't have time, but I would love to know more about these fathers that are found in the Wehrmacht, that are not actual fathers, I understood, right? They are made to be fathers of children to improve their status. So how this is done and how are they identified? And I have stories for you during break.
Later on.
Actually, I have to say it's a mystery because I can only take it from the account of his secretary, as Dr. Lustig's secretary. She mentions it, but she doesn't really give any evidence of it. So that's why I only came to the conclusion of why they might have looked for the fathers, but I also found it really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's a trope. I mean, I just saw this new play of Tom Stoppard. This is a trope in Leopoldstadt in which someone is paid to become a fake lover of the mother and therefore a biological father of a child who was obviously born.
Exactly, and that's the only way it would have been done. It's connected to something.
Thank you very much for all three presentations, which are fascinating. I'll be briefed in my sort of one question to Shulamit, because it's a question of timeline, and if you're standing in the shoes of a Nazi decision maker, there appears to be a bit of a dichotomy. There is a decision for sterilization, but the deaf person is allowed to remain alive. It's consideration for the next generation not to be there, i.e. for the child to be sterilized. So on the timeline of the final solution, is there a timeline where that decision was taken? Because obviously if you, after the final solution, stand in the shoes of a Nazi decision maker, surely the decision would be to kill the deaf child. It's not a person of allowing the deaf child to live and the next generation to be non-existent due to sterilization. There appears to be a dichotomy of permitting the deaf child to continue to live, if you know what I mean.
Kind of. So what is it?
The question is there a timeline of the sterilization processes? In other words, at a certain point they said there's no more sterilization, deaf children must die.
Of course, about the Jews we're not talking, because the Jews, they wanted to be killed and all that. So
right.
For sure we're talking about the non-Jewish. So what are you asking, if there's a time that...
Well, it's a question of a dichotomy. There is a certain, well, it's not just Jews, because obviously there was also the question of gypsies and things of that nature. So it wasn't just somebody who was not perfect. They didn't want the next generation to be there, and therefore sterilization. But there seems to be a dichotomy of, yes, but that child can live, we just don't want them to have another...
So after the sterilization, they continue their life regularly?
Yes, but that's a dichotomy of they're allowed to live. As opposed to the final solution is, no, the final solution means you have to die now, sort of like off to the death camp. So there appears to be some sort of dichotomy on the decision-making process of the final solution, everyone off to the death camp to live, and no, this lot, even though you're not perfect, you can carry on living, just be sterilized.
Right, and not to continue
but that's all the sterilization law. The Germans are sterilizing hundreds of thousands of people.
Yes, but it's that dichotomy of, there's the death camp, you're not perfect, you have to die, but this lot is only to be sterilized and can live. They just don't want the generation afterwards to be ever existed. So is there a timeline?
Yeah.
Is there a timeline there? As in, at a certain point, sterilization will stop, and everyone was sent to the death camp.
They are not sent to death camp because they are not Jews.
But, right, exactly. That's what I'm.
Yes, but
exactly.
it's not just about the Jews, because you also have gypsies and that.
They
Was
don't
there
send Germans to death camps if they can sterilize them. That's generally bipolars, whatever, traumatized from PTSD. They do not send to camps, they do not kill, they sterilize. This is the
And also we
option.
saw how they continued their life. After they were sterilized, they were regular citizens, and nothing was the purpose of just to kill them and that's it. Like, after sterilized, they continued.
So that's the dichotomy, is that you don't want the next generation ever to be lived by sterilization. But this one, who's not perfect, who's not Aryan, could.
That's biopolitics.
Well, that's what my point is that...
What do you expect a perfection of, Nazi worldview in which everything clicks to...
That's the dichotomy which I'm pointing out. That's the question. Yeah.
It's a good
Yes. I mean, Professor Collins has picked it up. It's the dichotomy in the whole notion of...
But the whole notion is
crazy,
right?
I have a question for both of you. Well, it's nice to hear something more in my territory, the Balkans. No, I was surprised that you pointed to all these health workers or doctors, and I mean, I know that all this happened usually during the early points of the war, but I was surprised that there were no suicides. For example, when the Jews were taken to like killing centers and concentration camps like Savitz and Topskova Shupa in Belgrade itself, you didn't present any suicide, and it's in a way it's logical that when they were taken to all these killing centers or home deterioration camps, that they knew what was going on because it was a mass phenomenon. But it was interesting how you sort of pinpointed it to areas, and it wasn't like a mass phenomenon, but it was in specific places. Later, I'd like to talk to you about more specifics, but that's not of interest to us.
Thank you for your question. I only researched Yugoslav Jewish health workers. There were probably suicides, but no data for health workers. That is all. 19 Yugoslav Jewish health workers, according to 4 sources. List of Jewish victims. List of Yugoslav health workers victims in Yugoslavia in the Second World War. The censuses for the census of victims in Yugoslavia, literature, and the online database of Yatash. Based on these 19 victims, I can conclude only, I can view only 2 conclusions.
One comment to the discussion we just had across the floor, and then I have a question for Shulamit. What you call it, the dichotomy is more like a continuum of an increasing radicalization, because many of the patients, who be they Jewish or non-Jewish or whatever, were sterilized in the first run, and then they were taken into euthanasia process in 1940-41 and killed. Same people that had already been neutralized, the DNA had already been neutralized. It is a timeline, it is a radicalization. But I wanted to ask you about the period before the T4. We know that Jews in Germany very often had difficulties grasping the radicality of the Nazi measures. So there are many examples of protests, Jewish protests against Aryanization, against this and the other law and things like that. Do you also have protests from parents or from organizations or from churches or whatever against the sterilization of the deaf?
it's a good point, but no, I didn't check it a lot, but it's something that I will think about more.
Yeah, I mean,
I just-
there was massive protest against.
With the sterilizations, they went to a sterilization court. And in the sterilization courts, there were objections. The first big study of sterilization by Gisela Bock, she discovered these protests against sterilization, and some were successful. So that there should be protests against cases of the deaf being sterilized. So you just have to find those within the massive documentation.
Yes.